Okay, so when it came to traditional animation, it was natural for my parents to assume that anything that practically resembled a Disney movie was always appropriate for young Ryan, because it was, and surprisingly still is, naively assumed that animation equates to being child-friendly. It's not. But specifically, I can recall a rather unusual film that caught me off guard as a kid, because while it looked like your typical harmless Disney Bugs Bunny nonsense, it wasn't. It really, really wasn't. Firstly, let's get this out of the way. Most of, if not all of us, have heard of Animal Farm in some capacity. Any kid who did secondary school English more than likely came across George Orwell's novel about a group of farm animals who rise up against their owner's tyranny. But really, it was an allegory on the 1917 Russian Revolution and Joseph Stalin's reign of terror, given the book released shortly after the Second World War. What? You can't see the subtext in this? Anyway, for those that haven't, think of it as Chicken Run, except it's a harsh political metaphor for Nazi concentration camps, which that movie technically was, given it was a homage to a movie about escaping a Nazi prisoner of war camp. So I call attention to it because I'm surprised that quite a few folks reference the film as having a similar level of subtext, and it made me want to go back and explore what exactly this enigma of my childhood was all about, because as far as I was concerned, I just thought it was a kids movie for edgelords. This 1978 British animated film, adapted from the 1972 novel, has a long-standing controversy with the British Board of Film Classification here in the UK. They give it a certificate U, meaning universal and suitable for all audiences. Now, when you see that rating and compare it to animals getting the shit kicked out of them in very gruesome ways, you question the reasoning behind it. The BBFC acknowledged the use of violence, threat, and the worst offender of all, bad language, but that didn't stop them from giving it the all clear, and to this day, they're still receiving backlash from it.
You free? We please don't die.
It's no use.
We got you out.
What should we do without him?
As such, there's a bit of discrepancy over who this is actually made for, and that also goes for the book itself. Author Richard Adams published it through Rex Collings, who was primarily known for children's literature, but Adams himself has always been adamant that the story is for anyone who wants to read it, so he never wrote it with a particular demographic in mind. In fact, I think Guillermo del Toro best summarizes what the story demographically represents.
The film was the moment in which a kid my age came to realize animation was not just a medium for children's stories, but it could be something else. I saw Watership down at the right age, right at the moment when I was about 13, 14, and I was leaving behind my childhood and entering my teen years, and the movie was sort of a rite of passage.
Now, the lack of a demographic makes sense given Adams wasn't even an author when he wrote it. He spent time in the army before continuing his education and ended up in civil service for most of his life, before his daughters encouraged him to publish his car journey stories into a novel. And that was practically the extent to which Adams thought about his story contextually. To him, it was purely a recreational story translated into a novel and nothing more. There is no allegory, metaphor, or subtext, and while many critics have their own interpretations, Adams openly disputes them as unintentional. So this leaves me in a bit of a dilemma reading both the book and film. Of course, you have all the hero's journey characteristics of Homer's Odyssey and Virgil's Aeneid, which tackle the complexity of fate, conflict, self-purpose, and eventually lead to religious and mythological symbolism, but in respect to our boy Adams rebuking all this pretentious pseudo-intellectual bullshit, if we're going to treat this purely as just a story about rabbits, that's still probably the most profound way of looking at it. But honestly, there's no way you can look past the symbolism, even if it was unintentional. Watching it, I can certainly see the Animal Farm comparisons given how real the film is presented. You could literally replace the animals with humans and the story would still make absolute sense. It's easy to apply the wartime interpretation to a bunch of civilian rabbits trying to cross treacherous enemy terrain in search of sanctuary, especially given Adams was in the military and wrote several of his characters based on the soldiers he served with, so it's very apparent that the story is naturally infused with his personal perspective. Like with the unrelated Douglas Adams, who had just released a little radio show called The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy the same year the Watership Down movie came out, there's a low-key observational style of humour that attributes common British behaviours and attitudes to its anthropomorphised rabbits with a rather stark authenticity.
I've never seen anything like that before.
The man thing killed it.
A man thing?
A hoodoo-doo. It runs on it.
A what?
A hoodoo-doo.
It runs on it?
Yeah, faster than we can.
It's dangerous then. Could catch us.
No. It won't take any notice of us at all. I'll show you. Watch this. See? It's not interested.
This is a survival story after all. Nature is presented as beautiful and free, but also violent and harsh. Just think of it as The Revenant with rabbits, basically. In the film we get these pleasant, harmonious scenic shots as if from the eyes of a human, but once we're down in the ground intimate with the animals, that harmony becomes absent and the world is suddenly dangerous and pretty grim.
The field. It's covered with blood. Blood? Don't be silly.
At this point we're in the headspace of the rabbits, and their vulnerability becomes persistently emphasised as such cute, adorable animals are effectively victims to a much bigger and vicious ecosystem. Now, there is no getting past the mythological exposition that's established in the opening. The rabbits believe in this prince rabbit called El Aberrera, at least I think that's how you pronounce it, who is told by the sun god Frith to control his community from desperately praying for more food, given the increasing population of rabbits. But with El Aberrera's dismissal of the request, Frith gives each animal a gift, but some of them become predators and sought to kill rabbits, who in return were blessed with speed and cunningness to evade threats. I mean, you can certainly see the religious undertones many critics argue. The myth gives these rabbits a reason for their suffering and encourages them to fight onwards by implying hope at the end of their journey, and it's reinforced by how the same mythology is dismissed by the cynical rabbits who have lost faith in hope and have submitted to their suffering.
El Arra and his trickery don't really mean very much to us, charming as it is.
Rabbits will always need tricks.
No, we need dignity. And above all, the will to accept our fate.
Although, while it's very clear about people seeking belief systems as a coping mechanism in hard times, narratively speaking, it's more focused on the idea of storytelling myth as a means to inspire courage and or fear, as opposed to solely about having faith in a higher purpose. For example, at the end of the story, the vicious rabbit general Woodwort fights a dog while everyone escapes, but his body is never recovered or seen again, so the outcome is left completely ambiguous. But what it does leave, however, is a legend to scare kids who think Woodwort will return to haunt them if they don't do what they're told. In context to his sinister character, the narrator admits that this is exactly what Woodwort probably would have wanted, thus there's a fulfillment to his character regardless of the outcome of his fight. And this goes for the story's hero Hazel, who dies peacefully knowing his community are forever safe and continues his existence in the afterlife. But more importantly, his legacy will be remembered to inspire hope and bravery. Yet again, I think the discussion is less about what happens next and more about the legacy that inspires those that follow. Survival stories by default are about strength and persistence, and every character in the story relies upon this myth to overcome challenges, so the outcome of the story leaves an entirely new legendary tale for future generations, which speaks of Adams as an older generation passing his stories on to his younger children. The fact there is a recurring ghostly presence throughout the film emphasizes following in the footsteps of the past, so to speak, but despite Adam's insistence on the lack of meaning, what's significant to the storytelling is our perception of each legacy, given some stories are fulfilled and others just end unceremoniously.
Violet's gone.
It's a motif consistent in several of Adam's preceding novels. We could point to Shardik as a story about a lonely hunter trying to track down a bear he thinks has the power of God, and interpret it as a man trying to rekindle his faith, but The Plague Dogs, which was also adapted into an animated film by Martin Rosen and feels like it exists in the same universe, about two dogs who escape an animal testing facility and are chased by the government, has a much more, I guess you could say, bleaker exploration of myth and hope. In the book, Adams was pressured by his publisher into having a hopeful conclusion, but the film sticks to his original premise of the dog swimming out to sea, looking for the mysterious Isle of Dog, not that Isle of Dog, and ultimately succumbing to the idea that it probably doesn't exist. Except a glimmer of hope is found in one dog stating that he can see the island, and they both disappear into the fog. The island is shown during the credits, but it's left completely ambiguous over whether the dogs made it or even if this island truly is real or not. I think with Adams, he seems to portray existence as rather fragile and even futile based on your reading of the ambiguity and your perception of the world. Yes, he may not have thought about it in this way, but I can't overlook how suggestible most of his ideas are. We could just chalk it down to ignorance, but where's the fun in that? With these rabbits believing in this myth, the world by default is evil, dangerous, and seemingly cursed. You're never convinced watching it that safety is an actual viability given how the rabbits are always alert, on edge, and dread being exposed out in the open. This is what I meant when I said the story is like a human's interpretation of an innocuous animal's everyday life. As an advocate of naturalism, Adam's perspective is always sympathetic, and it's clear from several of his books he likes to perceive humans as taking animals and nature for granted. Not only are these rabbits fighting for their lives against other animals, but they constantly reference how humans interfere with their territory, not because they don't like rabbits, but merely because rabbits are in the way. In fact, one character perfectly encapsulates the feeling the story perpetuates.
There's something unnatural and evil and twisted about this place. It feels like mist. Like being deceived and losing our way.
Yeah, sure, from our perspective, you look at these free, untamed, adorable creatures frolicking in harmony, but realistically, they're always in a state of survival mode.
There's a bad danger coming.
That's not good.
So, I guess to conclude, we could say Watership Down is like a counter-narrative to the sentiment of most traditional children's storytelling. I know we have the demographic issue, but given its enigmatic status amongst children's literature and cinema, I think it's difficult not to see this as a direct way of presenting nature in its rawest form that's only further heightened by what a rabbit itself can symbolize. There's a purity, a comfort, and a vulnerability to it, and what the story ultimately provides is both a shocking and necessary realization that our perspective can so easily be readjusted by putting ourselves in someone else's shoes. Or, well, in this case, someone else's paws. Hi folks, thanks for watching. Please leave your own thoughts in the comments below, and if you enjoyed the video and you enjoy what I do here on the channel and you want to support the show, you can do so over on Patreon, where you can vote for future videos and even get early access. Until next time, you can follow me on Twitter, stay safe, and yeah, see you very soon. Bye.